So, my name is Rebecca Lowe. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator with the Lewis Public Library, and welcome to Science and Society. It Our Making Sense of the World Around Us. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys, as well as Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory in the U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Fred. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. Linda, Colin, and I are very excited about tonight's speaker and his topic. Our speaker is Sönke Johnsen, who is the Owens Distinguished Professor at Duke University in the biology department. And he's had a distinguished career to get that title in oceanography for the last 3 decades. And I urge you to get the book. The book is a fascinating tale of his deep dives and not so deep dives into the ocean, uncovering strange animals that you'll hear him talk about tonight with some beautiful pictures. He has a background in mathematics and physics and optics and art, in addition to oceanography, which enabled him to describe some of the things that he will tell you about tonight and that are in his book. So with that, I want to give him plenty of time to tell us about what he has seen over the last 3 decades in the ocean. Professor Johnsen?
Hello. Hold on. Let me try to get this screen sharing to work here. Make sure everything. All right. So can everybody see me?
It's
I don't
coming.
know,
Yes,
well,
it
not
is.
see me so much as see the screen. Screen's
Yes.
more interesting than I am. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. Very glad to be here. Very glad to talk, not exactly about the book, but about the same thing, which, I guess you could say is the book, I guess. And it's going to be in a few different parts. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about sort of my journey growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then, my growing fascination with the ocean. And then it's going to move in sort of co-fascination with the arts and photography in particular. And then most of the talk, probably like about 40 minutes of it or so, the bulk of it is going to be photography of different deep sea animals, photographs I've taken with different stories about the animals and the adaptations of life in the open sea. And so if everybody can hear me fine and see the pictures fine, I'm going to go forwards and hope that slides will advance. This here is just, just to show, me on a nice little dive in the open ocean with the beautiful clear water. And on the left is where I actually came from, which are the Pittsburgh steel mills. So I never actually thought I would be a biologist at all. Growing up in Pittsburgh, which was probably one of the most non-biological areas in the United States in the 70s and 80s, being primarily a collection of steel mills and slag heaps and, barges and so on, biology never even occurred to me at all. I was mostly interested in astronomy, physics, things of that sort, and went off into college. And after a number of different gyrations, was mostly actually a modern dancer and a visual artist, and then was doing math as well because people told me that I would need to be able to do something that would get me a job in the long run. And then I went off to become a kindergarten teacher, a first grade teacher. I was a carpenter for a long time, worked programming the original Macintosh, and then eventually ended up in biology. In retrospect, this has turned out to be a really wonderful choice for me, because the animals were more beautiful than anything I could ever imagine to draw. And I could use my background in math and physics to sort of figure out a bit about why the animals look the way they do. And it also just really satisfied my love for adventure. This is always the fun thing on Zoom. Very first slide exchange often does. There we go. Okay. So my fascination with the ocean, I suppose, began before I was even really cognizant of anything. I immigrated to America from Germany when I was only about 6 months old, actually on an ocean liner crossing the ocean, which is what people did back then. And my parents had little money for a good cabin, and so I actually came over in an orange crate with a pillow in it, and the orange crate was nailed to the deck of the ship so that it wouldn't slide around the room during the whole voyage. And since then, which of course I didn't remember this at all, my parents would always tell me the story of coming over. I just always had this fascination that, somehow I should be, out and away from land, that I should see this open ocean and be back there, even though, I had no memory of it at the time. Um, and coming over as immigrants, like many immigrants coming over, we had very little money. We came with two steamer trunks full of linens. I think my parents had a couple little suitcases, didn't speak any English, and the job my dad thought he was going to get in Pittsburgh when he arrived was gone because the person had left for Dallas 3 months before. So my parents hid us from the fact that we didn't have much money by being incredibly inventive. My dad would go out and find, in this case, telephones, which is what this is representing here. He'd find broken telephones on the street, repair them, and then we had telephones in the house. He would find televisions, he would find engines. My mom would make our clothing and try to grow our food, which was not easy in Pittsburgh. And she would do a lot of the art projects that gave us things for our walls, and my dad would build furniture inside the house. And so all of this left me and my brother with just an intense sense that just about anything was possible. And we felt that we were really quite wealthy because we always just had all these different things that we were able to build, and we had the feeling that we could do them. And this led us into two very different careers, but with a very similar sort of mindset, this sort of constructive mindset of like going out and exploring the unknown. This is just a picture of me and my brother, actually, showing us in our teen years. You could see that we were very good at growing zucchinis in Pittsburgh, but not terribly good at the corn. Um, and this is just to show a little bit of some of the sort of constructive inventiveness at that time that eventually led me to become a biologist. This was my brother rebuilding a famous old synthesizer from the 60s out of all the spare parts my mom had laying around in her kitchen. So it's made out of old forks and egg beaters and things of that sort. Me, on the other hand, I was building a gadget to measure light going through individual cells in the retina of eyes to be able to figure out what colors of light they were particularly able to see best. And so he was very much, said to be in the art world. I was said to be in the science world, but both of us were just endlessly fascinated with building things. Here you're looking at our two careers over time. I'm on the left, he's on the right. You can see that we went through a large number of fairly random things. My brother actually was, in fact, a deodorant tester for a while, an extremely good saw player. I did teach dance and run a daycare center and was a mathematician, worked on starfish vision and bioluminescence, things of that sort. And he was a middle school teacher. We really jumped around, sort of weaving back and forth across that art science divide. Which we just really loved and never thought of them as two separate things. Um, and I always like to show this painting here because it really gets across how the arts and is particularly biology were so tightly interwoven. This is a watercolor actually made on the deck of a ship by a very famous oceanographer, Alistair Hardy, who was one of the people who understood how animals moved in the currents of the open sea. But one of the things he would do in this sort of color photography age was to make these beautiful watercolor drawings of, all the animals that came up in the trawl nets. And I just love this because it kind of pulls together how we really need to think of arts and sciences as, being part of the same creative spirit. Um, my original sort of memory of the ocean, aside from that trip over, which I don't remember, was going here to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We're here looking at Ocean View Cottage Court, which is a truly miserable little hotel, well, motel kind of complex on the beach. But it gave me my first access to being in the water. And I just truly loved it and would be out there like 10 hours a day, every single day, and, would have moved my entire life there if it was possible, rather than the only 2 weeks a year that I actually got. Here you can see, us just having a good time. But the picture on the lower right is really there to show that my sense of the ocean was wrong. I was really only seeing the very edge of it. For me, the ocean was, the beach, the sea oats and the dunes, all the little sort of mole crabs and shells that washed up. And, it's like sort of mistaking like the rind of an orange for the orange. You're really only seeing the edge of it, and you're not really getting the full experience of what's actually inside the orange. Um, so this inspired me enough after all those different careers to go off into a career in biology, though I'd never done any biology before. And this is Lou Key, which is a very beautiful coral reef off the Florida Keys. And again, I was in the water. I was loving it. I was there about 10 hours a day. And it was very much like being inside a beautiful aquarium. The water was clear, so many different animals. But again, you're really only seeing the edge of what's really the ocean. And now you imagine the ocean is like this beautiful large aquarium, like Finding Nemo, where there's all these different fish and all these different corals. But this is just this tiny strip around the edges and really only in a few parts. And so I continued to get, sort of involved in this. And then at about age 30 or so, I went on my first oceanographic cruise with Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution in Florida. And it just totally blew my mind that when I went out into this ocean, it was nothing like the ocean I knew from my childhood on the beach or even my grad school days on the coral reefs. It was just this vast, incredibly clear um, place that had no smell whatsoever, um, and was full of things that I'd never even imagined could exist. And since then, this book in particular has been a description of this love affair I've had with this vast part of our planet that's probably about 99% of Earth's livable space, because not only the ocean's large in area, but they're extremely deep. This fascination with how, even though this is a large habitat, we know so little about it. And the animals are just so different and they're fascinating. And there really are. I mean, if we think about, what is this planet if an alien were to come and like stick their hand down and like pull up an animal, they would be pulling up the animals that I'll be showing you in this talk. They wouldn't be pulling up a rabbit or a dog or, even a caterpillar. They would be pulling up some strange pelagic snail, hundreds of meters under the open ocean. And we really are a water planet. And we just live on these funny little rafts floating around on it. Um, so the ocean is really difficult to actually see, despite the fact that it is large and, there's so much, to see. Getting out there is expensive. Getting under it is tricky for a lot of different reasons, pressure, light levels, temperature, and so on. And it's often said, with a lot of accuracy that, we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the bottom of the ocean. It's just extremely difficult to do. And for the rest of the talk here, I'm going to start with sort of shallow water, what's going on in the water that is, near the surface. It's not necessarily shallow as far as the bottom goes. In most of these dives, that I'm showing the animals from, the bottom is about 10,000 feet down. And so every now and then we drop something and we know it's not coming back. In fact, we can go all the way back to the main ship and have dinner. And at the end of dinner, we know that that thing we dropped is still going down, because it's got a couple miles to go before it actually hits the bottom. And so I'm going to talk about that area near the surface, and then we're, sort of going to get into a virtual submersible and look at some of the animals deeper down. Um, when we look at the animals near the surface, within about the top 100 feet, we do what's called blue water diving, which is scuba diving, but it has a lot of extra things you need to do, for a couple reasons. One is, you are out in the middle of the ocean. It's very easy to get lost. The water is extremely clear. It's extremely featureless. This is a pretty standard picture of what it looks like in the water there. You can see that there's really no difference no matter where you're looking. I've seen divers turn slowly upside down over time and not realize that they're upside down because it's so hard to tell where up and down is. And for this reason, we are tied together in a trapeze system. This is my graduate student, Jamie Fergus, and you can see a line coming off of her to the right. That line goes to a trapeze, which is attached to a down line, and the divers can move in and out by about 50 feet and stay together and not sort of float away or particularly float, go too deep. And there's a diver at the center of the trapeze, and their job is to pull on all the little lines in case a shark shows up. When a shark shows up, we typically leave. So at this depth, we find animals that are sort of familiar to people. When they think about the open ocean, they think about Finding Nemo, they think about jellyfish. This is a jellyfish called Orchistema. Like many of the animals out there, and we'll come back to this like over and over, they're just extraordinarily transparent. Many of these animals, you see them in the water for a moment, and then you look down to like grab a jar to collect the animal in. You look back up, and you know the animal's like within a foot or two of your face, and you just can't see it. This one you can see because it's got yellow tentacles, but many of these animals you just can't pick out at all, once they've sort of stepped away from your vision. Um, Another aspect out there is that there are no surfaces. We spend our life continually pressed into a surface. During this talk, we're completely unaware of the fact that gravity is endlessly pushing us into a surface. You're either being pushed into a chair, you're being pushed into your bed, you're being pushed into the floor. If you're standing, your feet are being pushed into the floor and so on. But if you're out in the pelagic ocean, the only surfaces are other animals. And so animals try to use each other for a surface because a surface means that you don't always have to swim to keep from going down. It means that you might have a way of protecting yourself. It means you have a way of particularly feeding on something. And so what you're seeing here actually looks like kind of a nice picture. You have this jellyfish, but it's got this big fat tentacle in the bottom. The big fat tentacle is actually a predatory parasitic anemone. And so this anemone has grabbed onto all of the feeding apparatus of this poor jellyfish, completely swallowed it up like, the alien thing that would grab around people's faces. And it's so this poor jellyfish, anything that comes in is, immediately being grabbed by this anemone, and very little is coming in. And this anemone is heavy. And so this poor jellyfish is also swimming very hard for the rest of its life, trying to stay afloat. And you see this pretty often that animals are just parasitizing each other just because they need something to sit on, anything at all. If we put anything in the ocean, everybody shows up because they want something to sit on in a world where, that just never can otherwise happen for you. Um, Here we have an animal that's more different. This is a comb jelly. It's also called a ctenophore. They're called comb jellies because they have these rows. You can see 4 rows on this animal, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and they're covered with these cilia, which are these tiny little hairs that form these plates, and they can be really, really iridescent, which we'll see in some later pictures. You just see this brilliant, like you see from a CD-ROM, this brilliant iridescence comes from them. This animal that kind of looks like a weird thing, like it's smiling at you, or whatever. It's got these 2 lobes, and it swims by not just moving the comb rows, but also by flapping these things together, kind of like a scallop shell would do. This is one is called Oceropsis maculata. It's about the size of your hand. Um, Going even further afield from animals that we normally think about, this is a snail. Um, but it's heavily, heavily modified to live in the middle of the water. And so the dotted thing you see in the middle is its shell. It's removed all the calcium from the shell, so the shell is entirely like gelatinous. And its foot, the normal foot a snail would use to move around, has been divided into 2 and is used as wings. And so the animal actually flaps around like a sort of a slow butterfly in the ocean. And the white spots usually aren't there. The animal is normally extremely transparent, but if you touch that shell, all of a sudden all the white dots appear. And this is a very common thing in the ocean, especially among the snails and something else called the siphonophores, that whenever you touch them, they become opaque. We really don't know why. We sometimes sit down over beers and try to figure out why, and we never have like a really good answer, but it's really common out there. This particular animal, I'm showing it upside down. It should actually be the other way around, and it should be hanging below a giant mucus web that's about 6 feet across that it uses to catch food. So it basically is putting out this giant pile of mucus that floats in the water. Things get caught in the mucus as you're going, and then it will pull the entire mucus web back into its mouth, strain out all the food particles, and then remake the web to keep what's called filter feeding again. Um, it's a to us like a fairly gross way of thinking about eating, but it's one that they do very well. This is another swimming snail. This one's called Cavalinia. Instead of flapping around slowly and gracefully like the previous one, which is called Corolla does, this one's got the two little flappers at the top and it kind of frantically goes like this. And they've got a heavier shell, which is that middle part there. And so they really do seem to be struggling their entire lives to keep from falling like a rock. Um, and I don't know how they manage it, but they do. Um, Here's another snail. This is a slug. It's called Philaroe, and most sea slugs, when you think of sea slugs, are sort of like little sort of rounded things moving around on a coral reef really, really slowly. This one more or less has turned into a fish. So it's flat like a fish. It's got a little tail like a fish. It swims like a fish, like wriggling along back and forth. And it's also bioluminescent. And so if you see these things at night, you touch them, they all light up and you see what looks like a whole bunch of little swimming fish, but they're actually little swimming snails. Um, for some of the animals that are trying to stay up, this is a crustacean here, a kind of a shrimp. They don't have the ability to make like big gelatinous parts that help them float around like underwater balloons. Instead, what they do is they have really, really long legs and antennas and other things that create a lot of drag, and so they very slowly fall through the water. And when they get, too far down, then they'll work hard to go back up, and then they'll fall really, really slowly again. Here's another example of one, and you can see just like how ridiculously long, their antennae are and their legs are, and there are these paddles on them and so on. And a lot of this is just so that they can fall slowly. The other thing is so that when anything swims anywhere nearby, it might touch one of these antennae or legs and then tell them that, there's something they should jump over and try to catch. Um, a lot of the fish out there are transparent. This is a larva, a young of a scorpion fish, and they just have these really transparent bodies. Here's a particularly pretty one. This is a larva of some kind of a flounder. And when they're young, they're not, the eyes are on both sides of the body and they swim around like normal fish. This one has these beautiful sort of iridescent yellow areas on the body, but for the most part is completely transparent. And you can really only see it well when you do flash photography, like we've done for most of these photos. Um, this is one of my favorite little animals. This is a little fish. It doesn't have a common name. We just call it Pristogenes, which is its Latin genus name. The whole animal is maybe about a quarter-inch long. So tiny, tiny little fish. And I've, mentioned, just how big the ocean is. And the pelagic ocean, with all of its depth and all of its emptiness, is just appallingly huge, and it almost seems pointless to move around it at all. But this animal's got this beautiful dorsal fin, and it's got these pretty patterns on the dorsal fin, each of which are like well less than a millimeter in size. And I always imagine it as like this poor little, like, I don't know, teenage boy, like in a huge empty field with a little corsage, like wanting to go to the prom or something like that. And this is the beautiful thing to show up there, because you only see it in the males in this case, this beautiful patterning. And, it's showing off, like this amazing thing that should make it a better mate. And it's going on the hope that, at some point in its life, which hopefully will be long, it will find another fish like it that will appreciate this little like colorful fin it has. And to me, it's sort of like the fish of optimism, because when this animal swims so slowly and is so small, you can't imagine it would ever happen, but it's prepared if it ever does. Um, so now we're going to be going deeper. We go down in submersibles of various kinds. This is the Johnson Sea Link submersible. Harbor Branch Oceanographic had two of them at the time I was there. More or less looks like a helicopter. There's a big bubble in the front made out of plastic that's about 4 inches thick. I'm in the bubble here on the right, taking a picture of the pilot, Dom Libertori. In the back, it's a steel chamber that is only open in the bottom. It's got two little portholes on the side. And that steel chamber was actually used for scuba diving at great depth. So they would take the submersible down very deep to, let's say, 1,000 feet, and then they would pressurize the back inside of the back to the same pressure as the outside, so that when they opened up the hatch in the bottom, the water wouldn't come in. It was like a moon pool, like you see in some of these movies about the undersea or whatever. And then they would swim out, and go scuba diving at 1,000 feet. Then they would come back in and have to go through an extremely long decompression series to be able to, not get the bends, which is what happens if you're too deep for too long. And 1,000 feet for any period of time is far too deep for too long. But the front is this sort of 360-degree, viewing bubble. Here we're at a depth of probably about 600 feet. The ocean water is so clear that there's a lot more light down there than you think. So even when you're at 500-600 feet down, it's about as bright as the room you're probably sitting in right now. It's like, good sort of evening room light sort of light levels. This particular one will go down to about 3,000 feet. It'll do work on the bottom if you needed to, but it's also really good at capturing animals in the middle of the water and also photographing animals in the middle of the water. It's not good if you're claustrophobic. You're down for about 4 hours and it's a very tight fit. This is a wide angle lens. I mean, the whole bubble is maybe about 3.5 feet across. And so, it's very up close and personal. In the back, it's more or less like a double wide coffin. You're both lying side by side, completely smashed against each other. So this is a deep jelly. This one's called Colobonema. I'm showing this one because, like many of these animals, it's extremely transparent because it's a good form of camouflage in the ocean. If you want to look like nothing, the best thing to do is to be transparent. And one of the things our lab studies a fair bit is like how animals make themselves transparent. I also like this one because it shows how iridescent even these transparent animals can be. The muscle layers here just catch the flash really beautifully and just make this, sort of beautiful iridescence. This is another jellyfish, crissata. And I often show this one because it's got kind of color in three different ways. The blue and the green are iridescence from the muscle. The red at the sort of the peak of the jelly on the right is a pigment, and then the sort of squiggly orange things, they're also pigments, but it's both pigments and scattering from what are a whole bunch of tiny little eggs. And so this jellyfish, which is really only about a centimeter across, is absolutely packed with eggs. This one I like because it has just sort of like a nice goth kind of like intense look. It's called Agenura. The species name is Citrata because they actually often look very lemony, sort of a yellow color. This one doesn't, just by the trick of the light and so on. But you generally, when you're looking down there, see them, you just see this really weird yellow jellyfish, and nobody has any clear idea about why they're yellow at depths where there's hardly any light at all. Some are just completely transparent through their entire body, particularly the family of jellyfish called the Narcomedusa, which is what this one is. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. Narcomedusa literally means like the sleeping jelly. I don't know exactly why they're called the Narcomedusa, but they are like just an extraordinarily transparent and beautiful group of animals. But when you go deep enough, even being transparent isn't a very good form of camouflage. If you've ever gone around at night, we live on a farm out in the middle of nowhere, about 25 acres. It's pitch dark at night, so we're always going out with a flashlight if we need to be outside. And if we shine that flashlight on a window of the house, then we see a reflection of that light coming back at us. So even transparent things end up reflecting light. So many of these animals, as they get deeper, have to worry about flashlights. And amazingly enough, once you get deeper than about 1,500 feet, a lot of the fish and a lot of the shrimp have flashlights. They have little bioluminescent organs around their eyes that have filters and lenses and shutters and everything else to operate like little headlamps. And they point directly forwards, and these animals use these headlamps to find things. And if anything's transparent, they'll catch that reflection and go look at it. So many of these animals will start making themselves either extremely black or, because the light down there is blue, extremely red. If the light's very blue, anything red just looks black. I mean, here it looks red because we're hitting it with a white flash. But if we were to look at in the deep, the red part of this animal, which is called Vampirocrissata, sort of the vampire, relative of that other jellyfish, crissata, would look completely black. Um, Another animal that has to worry about like different ways to hide is a jellyfish paraphila. I call it the Hershey's Kiss jelly because the inside of it really just it's just this absolutely luscious chocolate color and does look like a Hershey's Kiss. These are found in every ocean at pretty much every depth shallower than about 3,000 feet. They're what we call a cosmopolitan species, which means that they're just everywhere. They're pretty big. They have stunning bioluminescent displays. The whole thing just lights up like crazy all over the place. But when they're not bioluminescing, um, the whole middle part, which is where the food will be, their gut, is this, covered in this deep chocolatey covering. And what that does is it protects the animal from being made visible when it eats bioluminescent prey. So if you eat bioluminescent prey, the bioluminescent prey sort of lights up in a dying gasp as it's being digested and chomped up. Kind of like if you accidentally step on a firefly, it will still light up for a while. And so the animals need to protect themselves from being seen by what they eat. And so a way to do that is to cover yourself in this sort of chocolate covering. Sometimes we see things and we spend hours trying to figure out what on earth they actually are. So, on these ships, we have experts in all the different, fields of different animals that live in the ocean. I mean, some have spent their entire lives going to sea, and really know an awful lot. And then, we find something like this and we're just sitting around for a long time guessing and figuring and opening up books until somebody finally figures it out. This is a baby jellyfish. And it took us a long time to figure it out. It's really only about 3 or 4 millimeters across. It's a baby of another really beautifully bioluminescent jellyfish called a tola, that when it lights up, it spins the light round and round like those restaurant pagers. It's this blue light, and it just goes around and around and around. Really pretty. But when it's in its little baby larval form, it just looks like this funny little red nugget with these little stubby legs. And one of the neatest things about the ocean is that, all the larval forms are right there with all the adult forms. And sometimes they look completely different from the adults, which can make it really hard to figure out what's what. Um, this is an animal I always got a kick out of. One of the things that came out of the book is Natural History Magazine took one of the chapters, sort of the optics chapter, and excerpted it for, one of their most recent issues. And they put this on the front. And I've always loved this animal. It's called Hippopodius, which means basically horsefoot or horseshoe. Because when you take apart this thing, if you pull apart the different sort of sections, it really does look like a bunch of little horse hooves. It's what's called a siphonophore. Siphonophore is the only one most people see, and you may have seen if you've gone to the beach, is a Portuguese man of war. Most of them live way far away, and it's hard to, bring them back and so on. So most people don't know much about them. Some can be extremely long, like over 100 feet long. They pretty much all sting pretty badly. And probably the one thing that bothers me when we go scuba diving is getting caught up in a web of siphonophores because they really can hurt. This one is pretty small. It's about the size of a couple thumbs or something like that. But it has the neat trait that when you touch it, it becomes opaque. So right now, it's sort of halfway in between being transparent and opaque when we sort of touched it and watch it go. When it's not touched, it's completely clear, except for, the little bit of yellow gut and all that in the middle. And then you touch it, and with about 5 seconds, it just turns totally white. And then if you leave it alone for about 15 minutes to half an hour, it goes back to being completely clear. And it actually does this by precipitating proteins in its body. And so it has a lot of proteins dissolved. And then when you touch it, they all clump together. It's kind of like if you had like a bunch of sugar water and you pulled the sugar back out of solution and it became all milky because of that. And they just, for some reason we don't fully understand, do that every time, they're touched or bothered. I talked earlier about the ctenophores, and about we get back to the iridescence. The ctenophores, when they go deep, when they're shallow, they're transparent, but when they go deep, they tend to be beautifully, beautifully red, sort of red to like almost like a really luscious purple. One of them has these like really thick mouth around it that's like this deep sort of purplish brown, and it doesn't have an official name yet, but everybody calls it liver lips, because it looks like lips made out of like liver tissue. Um, and you can see these comb rows on the bottom here. Each one of these sort of yellow lines coming off the bottom is a packed collection of these little hairs. They're the same hairs that are in your gut, not in your gut. I mean, the same hairs that are in your windpipe, and the ones in your windpipe are endlessly sort of beating up towards your mouth, so that whenever you sort of breathe in particles, smoke, whatever, anything that would irritate it, these little cilia just keep pushing things back up out of your mouth to help clear your lungs. Otherwise, your lungs would start to accumulate all kinds of junk. And one of the reasons that the flu is so bad is that it kills those temporarily. And so you don't have what we like to call the conveyor belt. And so you're much more vulnerable to later infections like pneumonia after you've killed off those little cilia for a while. But they do come back. In the ctenophores, they're used for locomotion. And it's kind of like trying to paddle a big boat with just your fingers. The animals move really, really slowly. But they do have this sort of stunning pairing of this iridescence with this just beautiful red coloration. This is the first worm. This is called Tomopterus. There are a whole lot of transparent ones. Decided to show you one of the red ones. Each one of those little nubby things coming out to the side, they're called parapodia, and they help the animal swim through the water. The big transparent ones get to be about 2 feet long and just completely look like swimming chandeliers. They sort of spiral through the water and make little arabesques and so on, and completely clear. And as the light hits them, it's just one of the most gorgeous things you've ever seen. Not all these things are small. Um, this is another worm from a different family. It's called an alciopid worm. And the weirdest thing about it are the two red sort of circles all the way in the upper left-hand corner. Each one of those is an eyeball. So they have eyeballs that are huge compared to the size of their head. And they're one of the very few evolutions of the eyes that we have. The eyes that we have are called camera eyes because they work more or less like a camera. They have one big lens and then a retina behind it. We have them as vertebrates. Squids and octopus have them, and these alciopid worms do, in addition to some spiders. And so nobody really knows what they're doing. This worm, which is not a huge animal, swimming around with these really good eyes. And the weirdest thing about the eyes is they see ultraviolet light, despite the fact that these animals are found at depths where there's really no ultraviolet light at all. And it's been one of the weirder mysteries out there why these animals have these big honking eyes for their body that are out there seeing ultraviolet light. We know they're predators, but we really don't know what they're looking for. And it's again one of those things we just sit around like having beers or whatever, trying to figure out what on earth is going on here. This one I like because it kind of puts humans in their place in a way. This is Peobius. It's another worm. There's really not much to it. It's about, an inch long, and it's really nothing but a digestive tract. There's a mouth at one end, and then an anus at the other end, and a digestive tract in between. Nobody's found that much else that they do. They don't move much. They just float there. But once you get to depths more than about 6,000 feet or so, they are the most abundant animal on the planet. In fact, if, again, bringing in the alien, if an alien were to show up and just grab an animal of, macroscopic size, not like a bacteria or a virus, anywhere out of the earth, they would be picking up one of these animals. These animals that seemingly have a completely pointless existence are probably the most common thing out there on our entire planet. There's just this huge layer. They're just full of these things, and we don't really know what they're up to. They're just kind of down there, miles below us, sitting there, which always makes me wonder. This is the same animal, just photographed at two different times. They're really cute. It's another swimming snail from a different group. All the swimming snails are called the pteropods, the wing feet. These are also called pteropods, but they're called the naked pteropods because they don't have a shell. All the naked pteropods are voracious predators. Um, and they all specialize on another kind of pteropod. They have like their special pteropod that lives in a shell that they like to eat. And even though they look really adorable and have like, they're called sea angels, things of that sort. Sometimes they're called sea devils because it looks like they have two little horns on their head. But what's not apparent here is that that whole head can like split open in the middle, and then an entire Swiss Army knife of death comes out, whose sole purpose is to be able to pull a pteropod out of its shell. And so it's a collection of basically it's sort of a collection of like knives and hooks and tentacles that are perfectly set up to reach into the shell and just sort of yank this thing out like an escargot fork. And they'll just munch through one after another of these things. And so they're, for their size scale, some of the most voracious predators out there. They do have really tiny wings relative to their body, and so they're just endlessly flapping around. Must be a pretty tough life because they're considerably heavier than water and just have to spend their life flapping, 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 find another pteropod, rip it out of its shell, devour, and then just flap, flap, flap to find the next one. Once you get to more polar latitudes, like up around Newfoundland or so, the ocean is just packed with these things feeding on the shelled pteropods. This is maybe one of the last snails. This is a heteropod. Um, you can see again, it's really adapted to live in the water and not sink. Most of its body is just jello. You can see a little sort of conical shell sticking off to the left. It's got a big foot on the bottom that it sculls back and forth to move the animal through the water. And again, this one's a pretty ferocious predator with its mouth in the upper right-hand corner. And it's got quite good eyes and it zooms around. These things can get to be about a foot long or so and are usually so clear that they can be in a bucket in front of you. And the only thing you can see is the eye sort of sliding back and forth as the animal sort of work acting a little bit like an eel in the bucket. Um, this is an octopus, if you can believe it, but an octopus that never like crawls on the bottom. It swims through the ocean. It's got very, very short little arms, and compared to your average octopus, it's got like some pretty coloration and iridescence on it. But what they're most famous for, this one, which is called Japetella, is that the females, when they're ready to mate, have a blue bioluminescent organ around their mouth, which is in the middle of all these tentacles. And that blue bioluminescent organ is covered with a yellow filter. And so together it puts out like a green circle of light, which is quite rare in the deep sea. These animals are endlessly trying to find each other to mate and so on. And they're all doing it in the dark. It's like, going again to a prom, except all the lights are out and you have to identify everybody by their flashlight. And in this case, the flashlight of this female Japetella is a little green lifesaver floating in the ocean. And the males spend probably a significant portion of their adult lives looking for a little green lifesaver floating by. And then they know that, is going to be the Japetella and they will make more Japetella. This is another weird cephalopod. Cephalopods are the squids and the octopi. This is a squid called strawberry squid. It's also called Histioteuthis. This again is the same animal, but from two different views. So in the top picture, you can see that the eye is just really huge and kind of sticking out. In the bottom, the eye is a lot smaller. And the big eye is always looking up, and the small eye is always looking down. And so the big eye is more or less well adapted to see silhouettes in the downwelling light from above. And the smaller eye looking down is fairly well adapted to see bioluminescence. And we've shown, from video and other things, that this animal just never turns. Anytime it tries to turn its body, it makes sure that the big eye is always looking up and the small eye is always looking down. So another, name for this squid, they call it the cockeyed squid. So the world, the visual world can be very different, when you're looking up versus when you're looking down. I think this is the last cephalopod, and this is one that isn't quite a squid and isn't quite an octopus. It has traits of both. It's in a group they call the vampiromorphs. This one is called Vampiroteuthis infernalis, which literally means, vampire squid from the inferno. What you're just seeing here is one arm and the webbing between the arms. These animals have these like really large blue eyes, um, and they're typically either pretty reddish or completely black. And they're very slow, which makes them otherwise very vulnerable. But their trick is they live in areas where there's almost no oxygen in the water. At certain depths in certain areas, like off of San Diego, there are these very large areas they call oxygen minimum zones, where the average animal, like a fish, will suffocate. There's not enough oxygen dissolved in the water. But these animals, because they have a very low metabolism, do just fine. And so they can hide here in a world where, the only animals that can otherwise manage to live there aren't strong enough to actually do anything to them. It's like a little refuge for them. Um, so here we're moving on to crustaceans, the shrimp-like animals. Um, this again is two pictures of the same animal. This is Phronema or Phronema, some people call it. Some people think of it as the inspiration for Alien, because it does look a lot like it, and it also has a really evil parasitic life cycle. So what this animal will do is there's another animal out there called a salp that looks sort of like a little transparent barrel. It will find one of these animals, it will eat all of the animal from inside the barrel, and then it will change the structure of the material of the barrel to make it kind of like a hard plastic, kind of like vulcanizing rubber. And then it will lay its eggs inside this hollowed out shell of this poor animal that's, well, now dead. And then push around like a little baby buggy, these little eggs, and then the eggs hatch, and the little babies will stick around on the shell and continue to be pushed around as a little baby buggy until they get old enough to move on, and they're presumably like munching on this poor dead salp the entire time. Um, People say that this probably isn't the inspiration for Alien as much as it sounds like a really good story, but it really should be because for something like a salp, this is more or less like a death knell coming, and this poor thing's going to come in and you know essentially turn you into a pram. Um, this is related. It's called cystosoma, which means body like a bag, and the entire front end of this animal are just eyes. These things that just have enormous eyes, and many of these particular group of shrimp are like that. They're all fairly parasitic, like the Phronema. They're looking for something to take over to either use for reproduction or use for food. And so they need these really, really big, sensitive eyes to be able to find these things, because a lot of the animals themselves are doing their best to hide by being transparent or something else. Um, Showing this animal, even though it looks like a relatively normal kind of squid, because it's solved its flotation problem by filling sort of that big container in the middle there with something that's lighter than seawater. It pumps ions differently, so seawater has a lot of different things in it. Some of the things in it are fairly heavy, like sulfate ions. Some of the things are really light, like ammonia. And so it more or less does like a swap of getting rid of the heavy stuff, keeping in the light stuff, and it creates like a big ammonia chamber that it uses as a flotation device. And so these animals don't have to swim as hard. It also means that they taste really awful, because they taste just like ammonia. There are a number of squids that are like this too. One of the things we like to do if we, see some animals and let's say they're dead in a jar or something, there's always a thing like you want to try to eat it. And most of the deep sea animals just taste really awful. Um, this is a funny little critter. It's a shrimp that's inside a little spherical cavity. It's called an ostracod. And what makes this one in particular really interesting is it's really big compared to all the ones like it. It can be about half an inch to an inch, I guess an inch at the very most, probably more like half an inch. And it's got these two giant retroreflector eyes. That's what the big yellow cups are. They're just like the retroreflectors, like in the back of your headlight, except they're working in reverse. Instead of being set up so they shine a lot of light out, they're there so they can concentrate a lot of light coming in. So they act a lot like a mirror telescope. And so these animals have actually some of the most sensitive animals in the entire animal kingdom, which apparently they're using to find mates. Ostracods have a really complicated mating life. Um, so now getting to the fish, this is a larva of an eel. So, if you ever have eel on sushi or you've seen eels and so on, they don't look remotely like this. And for the longest time, nobody could figure out where eels came from because their young look completely different. This is what's called a leptocephalus larva of an eel. They can get to be about a foot long and they're just absolutely transparent. Here they show up more because we're hitting them with a flash and making them look as obvious as possible. But these things are just clear as glass. And like I said, quite big, and they will eventually, over time, turn into like the eel that we see closer to the coast or in fresh water. This animal here, a Pistoproctus, also called a barrel eye. In the front, the sort of the ball you see in the front on the right is one giant spherical lens that's always pointing up. And so this animal is endlessly looking up, and it's got a close relative called macropinna, where that whole front of the head is encased in a clear sort of submarine bubble. So it looks like the animal is actually like its own little submarine. The front end of it, it's just a big submarine bell. And then it's got these eyes, these giant, in the case of macropinna, these giant green eyes that are always looking up for things. Nobody's quite sure exactly what they're looking up for, but they're really well adapted to do it. This is to show you some of these like flashlight organs on these flashlight fish. This is a deep sea fish called Aristostomius. It's really well known because most of these animals have a blue flashlight. This animal also has a red one. And so you can see the red one, close to its eye there. And so it can put out a red beam and find all the red animals that otherwise think they're hiding because red animals normally don't show up under blue bioluminescence because red animals don't reflect a lot of blue light. But they do reflect a lot of red light. And so the red flashlight works really well. This animal also has huge, long teeth and a really weird jaw. And so that if it were to shut its mouth, the teeth in the lower part of the jaw would go straight through its brain. And so it has sockets in the upper part of its head where the teeth slide into back and forth. It's kind of like a saber-toothed tiger, except when it closes its mouth, the teeth all go inside the head instead of, sticking outside the head like you see in a saber-tooth. This one, I don't have anything particular to say about it. I just always kind of liked it. It's called a whale head. It's unusually meaty for a deep sea fish and pretty big. I just thought it had kind of like a nice soulful look to its eyes. Um, this one I took a picture of because it bit me. Generally, we don't get bit. This one, Echiostoma, also called bristlemouth. As you can see, the teeth are actually reasonably sharp. And I put my hand, it's always a little bit scary to put your hand in a trawl bucket. When we collect animals, they might be in like a big, large sort of a bathtub like thing. And we often want to work on their vision. So we do it in the dark so that we don't hit them with too much light at first. And so we're sticking our hands in this bucket of like 100 different species, some of which, we don't know much about, and hoping that nothing bites us or stings us or anything else. And I mean, who knows? Maybe it's taken years off of our life. I don't know. But this one in particular, it actually bites pretty hard. You can see that it's got this really large light organ, right under its eyes here. Um, this is an anglerfish called Melanocetus johnsoni. Not named after me, some other Johnson. And it's got this short little lure going right up. And it's bioluminescent at the tip. The little ball at the tip of this thing is like a little bioluminescent candle. And you can see that the eyes are endlessly pointed towards it. So this animal spends its entire life staring at, this glowing lure. These animals are also famous because the males are many, many times smaller than the females and will just swim up if they ever find a female, attach themselves and become completely parasitic after that. They'll dissolve their brain and everything else and really only leave their testes so that they can continually basically impregnate the female, and females can have up to like 20 of these stuck to them like little parasites. But the parasites are actually the males of their own species. There are a lot of different anglerfish with different kinds of lures. One idea is that maybe these lures are different so the animals can recognize each other in the dark. Again, there's a real problem trying to find out who to mate with in the dark because all you get is lights. from bioluminescence. And so maybe if these lights have different colors and different patterns and different flashing rates, maybe they can sort each other out. These are two animals of the same genus, but the genus has about like 30 species in it, and they're all sort of only really differ by, what their lure looks like, which is why we think maybe they're using it to separate each other out, like running around in the dark. Um, this one is just here to show just there are animals that are just really weird and cryptic. This is what's called a Nemerdian. Most people have never seen even a shallow Nemerdian. They're in mud flats. If you dig around in a mud flat, like actually not far from where you are, you'll occasionally find one of these, and it'll look like a long, really featureless worm, and then all of a sudden it'll spit out a nose that's about as long as its entire body in front of it. They're really kind of creepy that way. But there are open ocean ones that swim through the water. Just about everything in the ocean that normally, has like a funny little crawl around on the ground version on land or in coral reefs or so on, has a version that can swim more or less like a fish, which is what this thing is doing here, looking almost like an anthropomorphic submarine. Um, just the last thing, bioluminescence is exceedingly common. Probably 80 to 90% of the animals in the pelagic ocean are bioluminescent. This particular animal I've always loved because it mixes its bioluminescence in the water, just like with glow sticks. So when you get a glow stick at the fair, it's got a little glass barrier between the chemicals on one side of the stick and the other. And if the chemicals mix, then they can make the light with the, and so when you bend it, you snap that little glass barrier. And what this animal is doing instead is it has one gland on the right side of its mouth and one gland on the left side of its mouth. And when it's disturbed, it shoots both of those chemicals in the water. They mix in the water and makes light. It's called spew bioluminescence because it's more or less like they're vomiting light. And here you're seeing just a couple shots of, what happens, as it goes on. In the beginning, you get a big bright light, and then it starts to fade out. And the light can continue in the water for like 30 seconds or up to a minute. This last picture, it keeps going. This last picture here shows sort of how bright it can be. This was picture taken by me and a grad student at the time, Katie Thomas, and we always called it flamethrower shrimp because it just vomited out this incredibly bright gout of light all at once, which is really impressive. So as far as we can tell, it's like, one of the most, brightest bioluminescent animals out there. Um, and with that, I just wanted to, I thank all the different people, that have been with me going to sea, that have helped me writing the book, encouraged me on and so on. But I particularly wanted to dedicate it to two women that have had a real strong influence in my life over the years. On the left is my mother, who died this year at about age 84. This is her back in Germany going off to one of the first scouting jamborees in the UK on a train. And then on the right is my wife, Lynn Calder, an immigration lawyer, sitting, I think she's sitting on a doorstep somewhere in Italy. Both of them just taught me so much, both in, their own personalities and just in fountains of knowledge about so many different things. I mean, I would not be the person I am or the scientist I am without the influence of both of them. And with that, I just wanted to stop, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Sönke, thank you very much for a fascinating talk with absolutely gorgeous photos. I'm sure you have encouraged people to get your book where you have many more of these stories. We have a few questions we can try to get to.
Sure.
One is from Rod Walker. What is the density of life in the open ocean in the areas that you've been looking? Is it relatively uniform? Or are they lumpy or string-like?
The density of light?
Of life, the
Of
life
life.
of the animals that
Oh, it's
yeah.
generally the density is quite low, but it comes in layers. I mean, one of the neat things is that water has subtly different densities depending on the local salinity and temperature. And so it tends to form these like kind of like little layers, almost like if you were stacking some fancy cocktail where you put one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing. There's a much subtler version of that in the ocean. and animals tend to pile up along these boundaries, and so they form these thin layers. Um, they're also they're sort of pulled together by currents and taken apart by currents. And so certain regions where currents converge can be, extremely abundant with animals in the pelagic. Other regions can be very barren. On average, life becomes more and more rarefied as you go deeper. The top 1,000 meters is fairly populated. Below that, you can, let's say, do a trawl for 10 hours with a huge net behind a boat and maybe catch like a pint of animals. It can be very, very empty at great depths, but in the first 1,000 meters, there's a lot. And so, yeah, there are large scale patterns and smaller scale patterns that you see throughout.
You talked a lot about what these animals do with bioluminescence, flashing light to either find
Mhm.
something or signal for a mate. Do they do they have other senses, a sense of pressure or
They
sense of
do.
sound?
Yeah, well, so some use sound. It's not super common. Like if you go down in the deep sea, you don't hear a lot of sound, even if animals are abundant, except of course for the marine mammals, which use sound like crazy, and certain fish. They're very good at sensing pressure and sensing disturbance in the water. They do this via what's called a lateral line system, a line that goes down, in at least in surface animals, a line that goes down like the midline of the fish, but in deep sea animals, they can be surrounded by these long, sort of almost like spines coming out with very, very sensitive detectors of the things, so they can pick out just anything. It's like they'll have a cloud around them that helps pick out what's going on. So they can be very good with any sort of local disturbance of water or pressure changes. They can be really good chemically. They can pick up chemical senses. It can be tricky because everything's moving around all the time in the currents. And so it's not like when you're on the bottom. And so, like for example, if you smell a hamburger and you know which way the wind's going, you could walk upwind to the McDonald's. But if you're in the ocean, that's more tricky because the McDonald's is floating and you're floating at the same speed. And so you don't get quite the same information that you would on land where you're like still relative to a current. When you're inside the current, that gets harder. But, chemical sensing is important. Some use the electric field. Sharks are incredibly good at this, at, measuring tiny little changes in the electric field, and they can apparently use that to find, prey items and so on. So they use whatever, pretty much every sense they can. Light's always been a focus of mine, probably coming out of my visual arts background, but there are other senses that get used.
Well, we're getting near the end of our hour, and I want to encourage people to get your book, but close with the marvelous story in your book about the glowing astropods that you saw off of Belize during a lightning storm and that communication you noted between them.
Oh yeah, that was crazy. So there's always been this idea that maybe bioluminescence can be triggered by light. Mostly seems to be triggered by touch and so on. And we know that the ostracods are sending signals to each other, mostly to mate, and they'll form different patterns in the water where they'll do a dance and then light up at certain points in the dance. And then the shape of that dance in the water will tell you who they are. So we know they do that. And we were on the barrier reef off of Belize, tiny little island, about half an acre in size. And around us was a shallow region of the reef that was full of these ostracods, and we were in just a cataclysmic thunderstorm. And what we noticed was that every time the lightning struck, immediately afterwards, all the ostracods were sort of flashing back, and it just went back and forth for hours. Where the ostracods would do their little blinking, there'd be a huge lightning bolt, and they would blink back, and it just brought me back to like when I was a child and the old like Greek myths days where like there was the sky god and the sea god, and they would fall in love and so on, and it really felt like you're watching the sky and the sea talk to each other in sort of a loving way. I know that's not actually what was occurring, but it so much felt like that in these like cataclysmic storms.
Well, thank you for that wonderful closing story. If others have questions, you've been hearing a marvelous professor who's spent 30 years studying these things and teaching. I'm sure he'll answer your questions with a little email.
Yeah, I'm
So,
very easy to
oh,
find on email. I'm the only
yes,
person with my name in the country, as far as I know.
very good. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca so we can all thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So, as is our custom, if folks want to unmute themselves and applaud and say thank you, feel free to do so. But thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's really all right, everyone. Thank you so much for. Ooh, I'm going to mute that one. You got some wind going there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we hope to see you next month, December 3rd, for our last session of this year. And we're already planning for 2025. So stay tuned. So, everyone, have a good evening. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.